Bear with me, I just lost part of my talk. So I'll have to recapitulate. Did anyone notice what John Kerry did on September 11th? He met with Henry Kissinger to ask for advice about how to deal with Syria. Now, as we know, as we just spoke about, September 11th was not only the 12th anniversary of the Twin Towers, it was the 40th anniversary of Operation Jakarta, when Pinochet and the Chilean generals seized power and murdered tens of thousands of unionists and students and progressive people in Chile, a coup of which Henry Kissinger was the architect. And it was called Operation Jakarta. It was named after another coup that the CIA organized in Indonesia in 1965, when nearly 1 million people were executed in a few months. So when the President of the United States says they don't like Bashar al-Assad because he's a dictator, let's put that in perspective. If he were the kind of the kind of brutal dictator that they assert, it would not be a problem. Can you name for me one brutal dictator since 1945, one tyranny, one oppressive regime, from Pinochet in Chile, Onganía in Argentina, the Somozas, Duvaliers in Haiti, Syngman Rhee, Mobutu, Mubarak, apartheid Israel, apartheid South Africa, Chun Do-hwan in Korea? Can you name one that has not been propped up by the United States? Franco, Salazar, Papadopoulos in Greece, Everett in Turkey. It's an almost endless list. But it's fitting that that Kerry spoke to Kissinger about Syria, because actually Kissinger is very involved. His legacy is very much involved with this war, which I'll go into a bit later. But while as we were discussing dictators and military coups, there's another coup whose anniversary is this year. Not the 40th anniversary, but the 50th anniversary. Does anybody know what it is? Pardon? November 23rd, 1963, in Dallas, when John F. Kennedy was publicly executed, likely by forces in the Pentagon and the CIA, for failing to carry out a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And among his crimes were, in the eyes of the Pentagon, in the eyes of the CIA, were that he failed to send air support to the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which he authorized. He was for it. But when the Cuban people stopped the invaders, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to send in the planes, and he refused, out of fear of a greater confrontation with the USSR. And remember how they set up the Bay of Pigs. They painted U.S. B-29 Liberator jets with the colors of the Cuban Air Force, and they bombed Cuba. That's how it began. And then the pilots spoke to the press and claimed they were defecting Cuban pilots when they were trained CIA operatives. Let's keep that in mind when we think about the events in Syria. And also, Kennedy refused to execute Operation Northwoods, which was a plot to carry out terrorist acts in U.S. cities and blame them on Cuba. So, is what happened in Ghouta, is that an Operation Northwoods in Syria? This gas attack? Is it something that they organized? The record speaks for it. I'm not saying this to praise Kennedy. He acted for his own, what he thought were the best interests of his class and his family fortune. But the factors, there are strong factors delaying war against Syria, but they have by no means averted it, as Workers' World points out this week. Among those factors, the mass opposition, squabbles in the ruling class, who's going to benefit. You know, General Martin Dempsey, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, says we're not ready, meaning we don't have enough ships and troops on the scene, which is a big far cry from being against the war, but not being ready for a confrontation with Russia. And most of all, the steadfastness of Syria and Iran and even Russia and China against a U.S. war. But remember, this is not about starting a war. This is about trying to finish it. The war has been going on for 2 years. The U.S. orchestrated war in Syria has been going on for 2 years. And this is a question of escalating it. Are they going to abandon this counter-revolution like they abandoned the Cuban Contras on the shores of Playa Girón? Or are they going to escalate the situation? And they did not go, they went through a hell of a lot of trouble to set this up, not to continue along this path. They didn't do all this to save face and back down. Vladimir Putin wrote a letter to the U.S. public. The president of Russia wrote a letter to the U.S. public and also really to the ruling class a couple of days ago. And the very fact that he did that he appealed directly to people in the United States, outraged the bourgeois media. But he appealed to their rationalism. He said, you know, a strike like this in Syria would increase violence and unleash a new wave of terrorism. And look what happened in Iraq. People are being killed every day still. And, you know, it'll just raise tension and instability. And if Kerry could answer honestly, if John Kerry could answer honestly, he would say, and your point? Yeah. Because that is exactly what they're trying to do. And ultimately, I think Putin understands that Russia is a target, and China. That's why they feel they have no choice but to stand with Syria. Because no concerns about stability or, you know, he says, I think Putin says this is against your long-term interest. Their long-term interest, the long-term interest of Wall Street and the bankers and the oil companies is to make as much money as possible. Look at the Iraq War that Putin holds as an example. You know, it's called a disaster. You know, thousands of U.S. troops died. The country is in chaos. Of course, 1 million Iraqis died. But it was the biggest bonanza the oil companies ever had. You know, the removal of Iraq's national oil company from the world market not only gave ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP their most profitable years ever, it vastly increased ExxonMobil's reserves and the value of the company's assets. It made profitable the fracking that's going on right now in New York State and around the country. It made that profitable. It made profitable the tar sands in Canada. It made profitable which are destroying the native people's environment up there. It made profitable the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline that's bringing oil from former Soviet Central Asia to the Mediterranean. If capital could eschew a profit, it would not be capital. There's this quote from T.J. Dunning, well known, that Karl Marx quotes in Capital. With adequate profit, capital is very bold. A certain 10% will ensure its employment anywhere. 20% will produce eagerness. 50% positive audacity. 100% will make it ready to trample on all human laws. 300%, and there is not a crime at which it will not scruple, no risk it will not run, even to the chance of its owner being hanged. And nowhere are there bigger profits to be made than in the oil of the Middle East. I mean, the striking feature about this last few weeks has been the seeming desperation of President Obama and Kerry to both risk World War III and commit political suicide in order to bomb a small country 5,000 miles away that poses no conceivable threat to the United States. It's not desperation for the children of Syria. We know they don't care about children. We know they've supply the apartheid state of Israel an endless supply of white phosphorus and other weapons of horror. Then they murdered 1,400 people in Gaza, including 400 children in 2009. We know they've murdered hundreds of thousands of children in Iraq and drenched the entire country with depleted uranium, which is causing all kinds of birth defects and deformities still. We know they don't care about children here when they're cutting Head Start, when they're cutting aid for dependent children, and they're cutting food stamps, and when they're allowing NYPD, but police forces around the country, to murder young people in the streets or in their homes, like Ramarley Graham in the Bronx. If they cared about the lives of young people, why doesn't Obama press federal charges against George Zimmerman and the cops who murdered Ramarley Graham? No, the desperation that you see is the desperation to fulfill the needs of Wall Street, of capital, of the banks, of the oil monopolies. Their desperation for higher profit, for higher share prices, and a higher rate of return on their invested capital. The military-industrial complex needs war, of course. The retired generals and admirals who are sit on the boards of the war companies. They need to justify their continued plunder of the people's resources as schools and hospitals and libraries are being shut down and as food stamps and Medicare are being cut. And what about big oil? ExxonMobil's profits, which soared during the Iraq War, were down 57% last quarter. But now they are rebounding on the prospect of war. But it's not only immediate profit-taking. Can they really sit back and allow Iran to build an oil pipeline through Syria to the Mediterranean to compete with the oil they bring in from Saudi Arabia? But most important, it's the Wall Street banks who are so linked to oil: Rockefeller, Morgan, oil, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, ExxonMobil, Chase Manhattan, Chase Morgan Bank now. But the central position of the Wall Street banks in the U.S. economy, in the world economy, depends on the oil of the Middle East, on the oil wealth of the Arab world continuing to flow into their vaults. Ever since the 1970s, that's been the case. You know, the Middle East, the so-called Middle East, the Southwest Asia, North Africa, the Arab world, Iran, was the key prize in World War I. The carving up of the Ottoman Empire, when France and Britain and Tsarist Russia divided up what's now Iraq and Syria, Palestine, Lebanon among themselves in the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. And when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar, they revealed that to the world. And the people in Iraq rose up, and what did Britain do? Poison gas. Winston Churchill said, I am wholeheartedly for the use of poison gas against uncivilized tribes. John Kerry didn't mention that when he was talking about how the world abhors the use of gas. They set up the Zionist project in Palestine. They used gas in Palestine, too, in 1938 against the Palestinian people who were rebelling against Zionist colonization, which was basically Britain's excuse to stay in the region. But also, Britain and France had the San Remo Agreement, which barred U.S. oil companies from coming into that region. They wanted to keep it for themselves, a condominium of British and French interests. But after World War II, which the U.S. emerged as the inheritor of the capitalist world's power, with Britain and France so weakened, Saudi Arabia, there was a meeting on the destroyer Quincy between President Roosevelt and King Saud, in which the U.S. Standard Oil was given a monopoly on the oil of Saudi Arabia. It was actually happening as this meeting just sealed it. It had been happening for a while, and they created the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, which was basically controlled by the Rockefellers and by Standard Oil Trust. And a few years later, the United States supported the creation of Israel and the expulsion of the Palestinian people from their land to create to break the Arab world in half, to divide Africa from Asia, and create what amounts to a permanent U.S. military base in the region. But this expansion of U.S. oil interests in the region, and especially in the Arabian Peninsula, came head-to-head with a rising tide of nationalism sweeping the Arab world. And sweeping Iran, sweeping the oppressed countries, the national liberation movements around the world that arose in the aftermath of World War II. And in this part of the world, we had the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, when Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power and nationalized the Suez Canal. In 1952, Mossadegh, the same year Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister of Iran and nationalized British oil interests there. The Algerian War for Independence against France, in which 1 million died, broke out. In 1958, the British-imposed monarchy of King Faisal was overthrown in Iraq, and the Qasem government came to power, which said our goal is not to get a higher price for oil, but is to get to permanently change relations, so we're no longer dependent on the sale of oil. And the CIA tried to assassinate him and eventually succeeded. And what happened, basically, that period was a period of war, of conflict throughout the entire region that characterized the last half of the last century between monarchist forces allied with the United States and nationalist forces, as they were represented by the Nasser government in Egypt, the Qasem government in Iraq, the Ba'ath government in Syria. One case, there was a bloody civil war in Yemen. There was a Republican revolution in Yemen, and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia intervened to try to overthrow it. And there was a war in which hundreds of thousands died. And Egyptian troops came in to help the revolution. And what tilted the balance back against nationalism and in favor of the pro-U.S. monarchies was Israel. It was the 1967 war, which Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt and Syria and Jordan, and seized the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, which is Egypt's only source of oil, and it shut down the Suez Canal, which was Egypt's main source of revenue. And that's what led actually to Egypt's, after the death of Nasser, the Camp David Agreement, and the price for Israel's withdrawal was that Egypt would break with the USSR under Sadat, would realign with the United States, and would open its economy to U.S. interests. But in the mix in all this, at the time of the 73 war, the United States was plagued by a balance of payments deficit caused by maintaining a global military machine, especially the war in Vietnam. At the end of World War II, the U.S. imposed on the world an agreement called Bretton Woods, where the dollar was the world's reserve currency, and the dollar was the only currency in the world that was backed by gold. And as the U.S.'s balance of payments deficit soared to pay for its military machine, under Nixon, they pulled off one of the biggest heists in history. They took the dollar off the gold standard. Basically, it meant like if you'd written hundreds of checks to thousands of people, and they said, by the way, there's no money in the bank, what are you going to do about it? Call a cop? I am the cop. We're the biggest power around. What are you going to do about it? And as a result of this, there was the price. It left particularly the oil-producing countries. The U.S. was the world's biggest oil consumer, with millions of dollars, which were not backed by gold. Promissory notes, checks, checks with bounced check, rubber checks, and that it was in response to that the oil-producing countries began raising oil prices and moving to nationalize their oil. It was led by Libya, by the nationalist governments in Libya, which came to power in 69, and Iraq, which nationalized its oil in 1972, but while making a friendship agreement with the USSR. But even the key pro-US regimes like Saudi Arabia and Iran were forced to nationalize their oil. And Henry Kissinger was the architect of an arrangement with those gut regimes where he said, okay, we will allow you to do that. You can raise the price of oil, you can nationalize on this condition. All that money has to come back to us, has to go into our banks, has to be spent on our arms, or the threat is that U.S. troops or Israeli troops will seize the Saudi oil fields, the Arabian Gulf oil fields. And and this giant protection racket and the huge inflow of dollars into U.S. banks as a result of that is really the key to the financial power of U.S. banks on a world scale. I mean, a lot of the arrangements, actually Aramco was nationalized, but if you look at its board, it's mostly made up of retired executives of ExxonMobil or other U.S. oil companies and U.S. bankers. The Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency was put under the arrangement was this: the Shah of Iran dealt with Rockefeller and the Chase Manhattan Bank. The Saudis dealt with, put all their money in Chase Manhattan. In 1979, Chase Manhattan lost its biggest depositor, and the U.S. arms industry lost its biggest overseas customer when the Iranian Revolution swept the Shah from power, despite thousands being shot down in the streets by the Shah's U.S.-supplied weapons. And Carter will forever be hated by the ruling class as the president who lost Iran. The U.S. response was to try to encourage Iraq to attack Iran. And there was a bloody 10-year war, 8-year war, where nearly 1 million people died. and the U.S. through Saudi Arabia and Egypt encouraged, facilitated Iraq's war on Iran, their hope was that the result would just be so destructive to both countries that one or both of them would be forced back into the arms of U.S. capital. And when that did not happen, Iraq became the target. And from 1991 to 2003, there were sanctions, and finally culminating in the 2003 invasion. And since then, the target has been Iran. Reagan said in 1980, we will never allow a revolution in Saudi Arabia. But this whole protection racket rests on the credibility of U.S. military might. Carter set up the Rapid Deployment Force for the specific purpose of seizing our Arabian oil fields, and that then later became the U.S. Central Command. But beyond this contradiction, this immediate contradiction with Iran, lies an even bigger developing contradiction with the BRICS countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China is called. But also it refers to a block of developing countries who are, except for China, not socialist, or no longer socialist, but who have are developing independent, or building relations among themselves. In 2009, when Israel was attacking Gaza, I believe Sarah and I were at a conference in Beirut, where it was organized by the Lebanese resistance. But what was striking was the presence. They were bringing together people from Venezuela, from Iran, in the interest of the Lebanese resistance was doing this, promoting what they called a South-South unity. And it's based, a lot of people on the left will tell you that these countries are not anti-imperialist. I mean, obviously Venezuela certainly is, but speaking of Russia or even Syria, but anti-imperialism is not a state of mind. It's a state of being. I mean, the contradiction is that the U.S. imperialism has no room for the growth of productive forces that it does not own. The world capitalist market has no use for any economic development that does not go through Wall Street. All paths have to go to Wall Street. And these countries want to develop their productive forces, which is progressive and they're right, and the United States wants to stop them. And that's what really is underlying the struggle here. Spoken 20 minutes. There's another silly idea out there about energy independence, that like if the U.S. were no longer to import energy from the Middle East, it would not need to go to war there. This pressure would be off. But back in 1950, I forgot to mention, when the U.S. got into Iran's oil, when they overthrew them, the CIA overthrew the Mossadegh government. And then, as a return, they put the Shah back on the throne, and he gave Gulf Oil a 25% cut of the country's oil. Back then, the U.S. did not import a drop of oil from the Middle East. They wanted to own it to sell it. It's about profits. It's not about oil for use. There's a Leo Huberman, who was a Marxist academic, wrote a book called Man's Worldly Goods in the 1930s, basically describing the capitalist economic crisis. And he ended with an anecdote about a method of catching monkeys in, I think, used in Southeast Asia. And where is he going with this? And they get a coconut, a heavy coconut. They drill a hole in it. They put a lump of sugar inside. The monkey reaches inside, grabs the lump of sugar, but with the sugar in his hand, he cannot get it out of the coconut. But he will not let go. This is capitalism, this is imperialism. They are going to do what they have to do. They are on a course towards war sooner or later because their system demands it. To say it's against their own interest is like saying it's against their own interest to pollute the air or cut down trees or throw millions of paying workers out of jobs or cut back benefits and pensions when people can't buy their products. They have to do it. Their system demands it. It doesn't matter. It's an irrational system. But this war the impending war in the Middle East, the ongoing war against Syria, against Iran, the impending war against Iran, perhaps even against Russia, is more than anything a banker's war. It's a war against us. It's a war against the world working class, which we're part of. And it's a war against our schools and our hospitals and our cities and our transit systems and our jobs, both because, of course, all those things are being robbed and plundered and shut down to feed the war machine, but also because it gives the banks more power. And whatever, these are the bankers who destroyed Detroit. These are the bankers who are foreclosing our homes. Are we going to support a war to make them richer? Because the more wealth they have, it's used against us in the long run. Look at the Cold War, the biggest victory U.S. imperialism ever had. Have things gotten better for workers in this country since then? Since the U.S. won the Cold War? I just want to make one more point about the crisis the fall of the USSR posed, and this ties into this, because this huge victory opened, as Fred points out in low-wage capitalism, for example, Fred Goldstein points out in low-wage capitalism, for example, it drove down the price of labor worldwide. It was a huge bonanza for capital, and it drove down the price of labor here. But like the introduction of labor-saving technology in industry, it became generalized. It cannot be restricted solely to the benefit of the United States. Japanese capitalists, German capitalists, Russian capitalists, Chinese capitalists who exist even though China's still a worker state, could all benefit from it. And so how the question for the U.S., the crisis facing U.S. imperialism in the wake of its victory, is how to turn it to its advantage, how to make sure that wealth comes to the United States. And control of oil is more than anything else is key to that. Okay, thank you.